And good evening from Philadelphia. Frank here with a Thursday night edition of UFO News Network Sunday. We're all ready to go. We've got a great guest, and to bring him on, let me introduce my co-host, the one, the only, Chant Hanna. How's everything going tonight, Chant?
It's going great, Frank. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be back. We have a very special guest on our show who's also a friend of ours. He's a very wonderful person. His name is Tom Whitmore, and longtime MUFON board member Tom Whitmore retired recently as a financial analyst with a local firm in San Antonio in 2019. Tom was invited to join the MUFON board in '95 and experienced the organization's progress through the successive administrations of 5 different administrations on up to the current international MUFON director, Jan Harzen. He serves as treasurer and focuses on long-term and strategic issues for the organization. Tom has been fascinated by military and intelligence agencies' interactions with the UFO public. He has undertaken a research study of the history of the MJ-12 affair and intends to eventually publish his findings. He participates in discussions of the MJ-12 topic by giving presentations to local UFO groups, appearing on internet podcasts and radio shows, and by communicating in social media. You can view his information on his blog at tomwhitmoreblog.wordpress.com. That is tomwhitmoreblog.wordpress.com, and I will be bringing up that URL several times during our podcast tonight. Welcome, Tom, on our show. It's so nice to have you on our show. I've been looking forward to this for a long time.
Thank you, Chant and Frank, and I'm very glad to be here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation tonight.
Yeah, thanks a lot for coming on, Tom.
How are you, by the way, Tom? How have you been?
I've been well for my age, and I keep busy. I try to put in a solid 4 hours of work on my project a day, and that's not chronological. That's not a time span of 4 hours, but rather actual 4 hours of work. And then after that, I take care of more personal business and trying to get my apartment in order that I just moved into in September. So I'm keeping busy.
Now, Tom, really quick, you moved to D.C. and are spending a lot of time researching at some various archives around there. Is that about right?
Yes, sir. Frank, when I first got here, as soon as I moved in and I got moved in, then I went straight to the National Archives. And I had the Cutler-Twining memo pulled. And I've spent many hours at the National Archives so far, and I plan to spend more. But I've been through hundreds of documents there, and I've also been through a lot of documents at the Library of Congress.
You pulled a pretty nice find, a meeting between, I believe, General Twining was involved and some other people, where the discussion was actually about flying saucers. I remember seeing that, and that was pretty interesting.
Well, the interesting thing was it was Twining's number 2, and those discussions took place on those on the chronologies that you saw that mentioned saucers. Those discussions took place while General Twining was out of town, so his number 2 was having those discussions.
That's interesting. You know, I wanted to bring up a very important topic that I know is actually extremely important to the UFO community for a very long time now. And I think that you, from my perspective, have become an expert in your own right on this topic, and that is the legendary MJ-12 topic. And I wanted to ask you what you've come up with regarding that topic. Let's start off with the definition of MJ-12 subject, and anything else you want to go ahead and follow up with after that.
The MJ-12 subject originated in the 1980s when a set of documents appeared anonymously with UFO researchers. And the documents implied that there had been a recovery of a UFO along with the bodies, and that a very special, very secret committee had been formed of 12 top military, scientific, and government people that were they were tasked with studying the problem and managing it. Now, the documents that were received are questioned. They're what we consider questioned documents. They've been very controversial, and some of them have been pored over and analyzed in great detail. and all kinds of things have been found wrong with them. Now, from my standpoint, I divide the subject into two areas. The first is the history of the MJ-12 affair itself. And by that, I mean the people that were involved in the documents coming into the public domain and the claims that have been made and the activities and the controversies that have ensued in the subject. And I believe I've expanded my definition of the MJ-12 affair to cover a period of about 35 years. And I started around the time that Leonard Stringfield was coming out with his crash saucer findings, and at about the same time that the book The Roswell Incident came out. And since then, we've had a series of question documents and claims and even videos that have come out almost up to the present day. For example, an MJ-12 related document came out in 2017. I call it the ultra top secret MJ-12 document. And then even within the last month, we've had the public, or within the last year, we've had the public exposure of the so-called Admiral Wilson and Kit Green documents. So the controversy, in my opinion, has continued even up to the present day. Now, that's the first part. The second part is the legend of the MJ-12 committee itself. And this is the legend that has developed largely out of claims and stories that came out in the 1980s. And they were related to not only the MJ-12 documents themselves, but a series of rumored histories of the U.S. government involvement with really serious UFO issues, such as crash recoveries, alien bodies, possible relationships with alien groups, and so on and so forth. And that I put in the legend category.
Tom, really quick, can you run through some of the names who were purportedly part of this organization?
The alleged MJ-12 members?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. You had Vannevar Bush. You had James Forrestal, who unfortunately died. He was replaced by Walter Bedell Smith. You had Admiral Hillenkoetter, Hoyt Vandenberg. He was four-star general, chief of staff of the Air Force. Sidney Sowers, he was an admiral, but he actually became a very close advisor to President Truman. Gordon Gray was an elite political appointee. There's General Montague that I believe was working at Sandia Base. Detlef Bronk was a very high-level authority on biophysics and physiological subjects. Lloyd Bertner, I believe, was a aircraft and aerospace designer. Donald Menzel was a Harvard astronomer, and he was notorious for debunking UFOs. And you had General Nathan F. Twining, who was Vandenberg's number 2 and eventually became chief of staff of the Air Force. And then you had Jerome Hunsaker. So those are the 12.
Can you give us a little bit more about the background of Forrestal and Vannevar Bush?
Vannevar Bush was one of the leading technologists of his time, and especially for the scientists, they had really gotten in on the ground floor. These men had started their serious work in the 20s. So by the 40s, by World War II, they were at the height of their careers, and many of them had broken new ground and had been experts in their field. And Vannevar Bush was a good example of that. He was an electrical engineer, and he was actually so high in the hierarchy. If you hear about, or when you think about the development of the nuclear weapons of the atomic bomb, you had geniuses like Robert Oppenheimer working for 2-star General Groves, who was just an awesome figure in terms of organization and accomplishments. And then above him was Vannevar Bush and I think James Conant of Harvard. There were 2 or 3 of those guys above him. So Vannevar Bush was very, very high in the hierarchy. And then Forrestal was, he had been successful on Wall Street, and he became eventually the Secretary of Defense during the Truman administration. Unfortunately, things did not work out well for him as Secretary of Defense, and he ended up having serious psychological problems.
And Vannevar Bush was also the founder of Raytheon, which is to this day a major defense contractor. Is that about right?
That's right. I was going to mention that, but I was afraid I might not be able to remember the name.
Well, Raytheon was also the company that built that FLIR contraption that captured the UFO video during the Nimitz case. So they were crowing about that right in the immediate aftermath of all that. And also just a little bit more about Bush. He was a pretty fascinating guy. He's also considered sort of the father of the internet. He conceived of a sort of hypertext and things like that back in the 40s, and also headed up the Office of Scientific Research and Development, which oversaw the Manhattan Project. So he was a pretty well-connected guy. So
and the
sorry.
Research and Development Board.
Yeah. Yep. So okay. Chan, go ahead.
I wanted to bring up just a little bit of MUFON trivia, and that is our network actually had a wonderful interview with Peter Robbins, and that was on 2/20 of 2019 regarding a fascinating discussion about James Forrestal. So I just wanted to mention that to our listeners, that not only will we have a really fascinating podcast here with Tom regarding the MJ-12 topic and maybe cover a little bit of James Forrestal here, but for a really deep in-depth discussion about him that lasted about an hour or two, to listen to that podcast as well.
Yes, and I've heard him talk about that. I've heard him talk about that on another program, and it's a very intriguing subject. But I think he held the good part back, and I never heard his actual theory on what happened. But that's a very interesting subject.
Now, you've covered the names of the alleged MJ-12 members. I wanted to know if you could move forward on past that into the history, the definitive history of the MJ-12 topic.
Well, in terms of the MJ-12 affair, I've got a pretty long list, and I'm going to read this pretty fast, but I know that you all are familiar with these, and a lot of people in the UFO community are. But we can start out with Leonard Stringfield's work, with the Roswell incident book coming out. Then we had the activities of William Moore, UFO researcher. We had the release of the MJ-12 documents themselves in the 1980s. There were the controversies about the Paul Benowitz affair. There were claims made by Bill Cooper and John Lear. There was the UFO cover-up live program. There were the Bob Lazar claims. Then we had a whole series of documents come out in the 90s associated with a researcher by the name of Timothy Cooper. We had the alien autopsy video. We had the Dan Burrish claims, the Serpo story. We had claims made by Robert Dean, and we had Stephen Greer's work, and we've had this ultra top secret document come out. In addition to that, Richard Doty has given a number of interviews over the last couple of years. I personally have reviewed 11 of them, and I've taken extensive notes. And then again, like I mentioned, we've had the Admiral Wilson and the Kit Green documents. This has all occurred over a period of 35 years. So this is a pattern, in my opinion.
So you mentioned Richard Doty now, obviously, and Bill Moore. Now, a lot of people are convinced that they are the gentlemen responsible for constructing at least some of these alleged Majestic 12 documents.
Well, Bill Moore has been under suspicion, but I personally don't subscribe to the view, and I'm not saying that he didn't do it. I don't know, but I don't necessarily subscribe to the view that he forged the MJ-12 documents for a couple of reasons. If what he said is true, when he received the documents, he sat on them for 2 or 3 years before they went public. And the only reason why he made them public was because Timothy Good in the United Kingdom was getting ready to release them. Secondly, people that create forgeries don't normally write 100 plus page books analyzing their own forgery. And Bill Moore has a very informative book called the MJ-12 Documents, an Analytical Review. Now, I think that in principle, if you ask Richard Doty about creating the documents, he will tell you that he had nothing to do with the creation of those documents. He denies it.
Or what do you think?
Well, there are different theories. I have, several possibilities. I used to think that they might have come out of Air Force intelligence, but one notion I've been mulling over is the possibility that they may have come out somewhere within the aviary, the so-called aviary. There are certain people that you can trace a lot of these notions back to them being such people as Ernie Kellerstrass and Dale Graff and some other individuals. I'm not accusing them. I don't know, but that is one possibility. Now, one of the things that's always intrigued me about intelligence work is it's their stock and trade to create phony documents. Intelligence agencies create phony passports, they create phony documents. They do that all the time. So first notion was that the documents came out of somewhere within the intelligence community. Now, there's another notion that, and Bill Moore has said this himself, and I can read chapter and verse, that there are certain people within the government matrix that were unhappy with the level of secrecy about the U.S. government's involvement in the UFO affair. And they wanted to get some information out of the public, but they had to do it in such a way that they weren't breaking any laws and that allowed plausible deniability. One way to do that is to create documents that appear to be official, but obviously are flawed and have red flags, and that allows plausible deniability.
Now, some of these let me get in here, Chet. Some of these MJ-12 documents actually do check out. There's supposedly a meeting where Truman, there's a document where Truman authorizes the formation of the Majestic 12 on a particular date. And as it turns out, that in the Truman Library, it's very easy to find on that particular date. You'll see a meeting with Truman and Vannevar Bush. That much checks out. So at the very least, these documents are pretty well researched. Is that about right?
Yeah. Well, some of them have been. And two investigators, two researchers, the Woods, Robert Wood and Ryan Wood, have really gone over the second real set of MJ-12 documents, which came through Timothy Cooper and started showing up in the 1990s. And the Woods have done a lot of work on trying to establish what, the level of authenticity or genuineness of some of those other documents. And some of the documents obviously are altered. There have been sections that have been found to be taken out of this other document or this book or something, things like that. But all in all, there's an awfully high volume of these documents. And for one hoaxer to create all that, somebody is going to have to sit down and do an awful lot of work, and that doesn't seem very probable to me.
Understood. So, Chant, go ahead. You have something here?
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask, Tom, if you feel that the Aviary group was created by the Defense Department to research ET weaponry and biotechnology, as well as run some kind of interference program on civilian researchers or investigators, or regarding any academics, science or military-related investigators regarding the topics we're covering here. Do you think that it was created by the Defense Department or any faction of any government around the world? Do you think the Aviary was created that way, born out of that? Or was it created through the Aviary?
The conventional wisdom is that Bill Moore had been developing contacts, and along during the years, the 70s and the 80s, there were people that had worked in the military and the government in fairly sensitive positions, and they were starting to communicate with one another, and they were finding things in common. Certain of them had heard stories or had seen things and believed certain things, and some of these people within the aviary were communicating with each other, and Bill Moore was developing his contacts, and Bill Moore, I think, was a little bit concerned about secrecy and security, and he decided to give this group of people that were his contacts to give them bird names, and thus the aviary. That's the conventional wisdom on how it came about. Now, go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, before you go any further, could you run down the list of some of the people who are purported to be members of this sort of like invisible college of some insiders and Bill Moore and all that?
I was just going to ask that question. What a great question. Fantastic.
Yeah. Well, let me think. Now I'm thinking of this off the top of my head.
I have a partial list in front of me in case you need me to remind you. I know Christopher Green is one of them, and if you feel like you want to add more, like Putoff, perhaps Hal
Putoff, Dale Graff, Bruce Maccabee, Ernie Kellerstrass, Robert Collins, known as Condor on the UFO Cover-Up Live program, even Jacques Vallée.
Right.
Rob Pandolfi's in there, Moore, I understand.
Shandera, yeah. Partridge.
No, Shandera. I think that's how it's pronounced.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Richard Doty.
Yes.
Those are some of the, there's C.B. Scott Jones, I think, was included in that.
We also, of course, have Bill Moore. Go ahead.
Yeah, Bill Moore, Ron Pandolfi, Kit Green. That's a lot of them.
I also have Partridge listed too. But no, I'm sorry, not Partridge. I apologize. Partridge and Hummingbird and Chickadee, respectively, were names that were attributed to some of these folks, along with Condor. Yes, so.
Yeah.
So could you tell the folks a little bit about what these guys were working on? It sounds like again sort of an invisible college, so to speak.
Yeah, and one of the most fascinating articles I found, Frank and Chan, is that there's a recapitulation by Bruce Maccabee, who interviewed Ernie Kellerstrass. And Ernie Kellerstrass, I believe, was stationed on Kirtland Air Force Base for a time. And he told Bruce Maccabee that there was at least one UFO stored at Kirtland Air Force Base. And I can send you the reference to the article later if you like.
Sure.
But it to me is one of the most fascinating things that I've seen. Now, you take Kit Green. Kit Green is a medical expert. He's a medical doctor, and he had taken over the so-called Weird Desk at the CIA. And Bruce Maccabee himself was an optical physicist with the Navy. Robert Collins was a physics person, and I believe that he had been stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. We all know Jacques Vallée. Bill Moore was an independent UFO researcher, as was Jamie Shandera at that point. Richard Doty, as we all know, was a special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. So I can go on and on.
Can you tell me a little bit more about Mr. Kellerstrass? I'm not that familiar with him.
I don't know a lot about him yet. I'm going to get into that in much more detail, Frank, and I apologize for not having more detail. But let me tell you something. I've got a to-do list a mile long.
I bet you do.
I've got a mountain of work, and I'm just getting started, really. So, pardon me. Oh, by the way, I posted an article on my Facebook page and on Twitter, which is an article by Ernie Kellerstrass that he wrote, I believe, in 1973, and it was published in Air Force Magazine. and it is about drones. And the thing that I found interesting about that was that Richard Doty has said that a lot of what Paul Benowitz was seeing on Kirtland Air Force Base were actually drone tests. So I'll be glad to send you that reference too, if you like.
Yeah,
Great.
you said you put it up over on Twitter? I'll find it real quick.
I put it on Twitter and I put it on Facebook.
Great.
Ready?
Just regarding that Bruce Maccabee interview, Ernie Hawk Kellerstrass was, of course, that was his nickname, Hawk, because he was allegedly a member of the Aviary. That was the name they attributed to him. And if anybody wants to read that interview part and parcel, I'm not sure if it's the entire interview that Bruce Maccabee did with Ernie Hawk Kellerstrass, but that's on realityuncovered.net. So you would go on Google and you would type in Bruce Maccabee, which is Maccabee, and then you would type in Ernie, and then Hawk, the bird hawk, and then Kellerstrass, which is Kellerstrass, and that interview will come up. It's a fascinating interview. I'm glad that you brought that up. Thank you very much for having talked about that a little bit. Wanted to ask you a little bit more about the MJ-12, and that is what I'm just going to ask you point blank. It's kind of an unfair question, but I wanted to ask you what part of the MJ-12, I'm just going to title it as a conspiracy, do you believe is the most credible to you?
Well, I always put it this way, Chant. It depends. The word is if, IF. If there was a recovery of a flying saucer, a UFO, and it involved bodies and possibly even a live alien, then almost certainly some kind of group would have been formed to study it and possibly control the information around it.
I'm very glad that you said that, because you and I had a wonderful conversation before the interview tonight, and I had told you that I had listened to you in a recent interview, which was really wonderful. And you mentioned something really fascinating that I wanted to bring up and then ask for you to expound upon it. And you said that, you mentioned something very interesting. You said Cal Korff wrote a book, and the title of that book, by the way, so our listeners know, is The Roswell UFO Crash, What They Don't Want You to Know, which is based on a now legendary flying saucer incident that allegedly crashed on a ranch in south central New Mexico, in Corona, New Mexico, in July of 1947. And as you know, Tom, Cal made a case that Jesse Marcel really exaggerated things. And what I wanted to ask you is about something you said on a program recently in an interview. And that is, you said, this was you hypothesizing this, and then I wanted you to expound upon it. You said something to the effect of, is it possible Jesse Marcel saw the debris at the Mac Brazel Ranch when there was in the actual vicinity of the same area of the ranch, coincidentally at the same time, a UFO? Hence, a comedy of errors commenced from that point forward. Now, I didn't really say that very well, but I know folks will get the gist of what you proposed as a possibility if you talk about that idea. And then you also said, in addition to that, Tom, that if there was a UFO crash and dead or alive or live alien bodies were recovered, there almost certainly would have been a committee to have studied this type of occurrence. So wanted to ask you about your hypothesis or something that you surmise could have been a possibility, and then also the committee that could have been created after that alleged incident.
Well, and Cal Korff pointed this out, and other researchers have pointed out, and even the Air Force wrote a phone book-sized report asserting that the Roswell debris was probably that from a mogul balloon. And we're talking about remnants of neoprene and balsa wood and tape with flowers on it and things like that. Well, there's a certain kind of a personality that we run into sometimes in the UFO field, and that is the kind of person that decides they want to see a UFO. And Cal Korff made the argument that Jesse Marcel had a record of exaggerating his service record, and he was known as kind of a person who liked to tell tall tales. I was theorizing that, was it possible that Jesse Marcel did see what he saw? He collected the debris that he had. It was actually debris, maybe it was debris from a balloon. But there was this incredible coincidence that concurrently there had been an actual saucer crash at another location in, I believe, southwest of Corona. Now, as a result of that, Jesse Marcel is coming back to the base with this debris, saying that he found a flying saucer. Meanwhile, concurrently, there had been an actual saucer crash, and somehow the story got to the press there in Roswell, and you get this big blown up headline, Army Air Force recovers UFO. So, and given that, and given the fact that a couple of days later they had to go out to Fort Worth and claim that it was just a weather balloon, maybe it was a big comedy of errors, and maybe the fact that an actual saucer was recovered was obscured by these other comedies of errors. I don't know. It's just something that occurred to me a few days ago, and I can't help but wonder if something like that didn't happen.
I'm glad you were able to bring it up, because anything is possible, and also it's really important to use to think about the creative possibilities of what things that could have occurred.
Yeah.
So,
Let me jump in here real quick and ask Tom a quick question. Now, one document that you know a little bit about, you said you pulled the original at the archives, and that is the Cutler-Twining memo. And it looks like I've got at least a piece of it up now. And can you tell the folks a little bit about that? That is nobody questions that's a legitimate memo. Is that about right?
Well, actually, they do.
Oh, okay.
And here's the interesting thing: the Cutler-Twining memo is a document that was allegedly written by Robert Cutler's assistant while Robert Cutler was out of the country, and it was instructing General Twining concerning an MJ-12 Special Studies Projects meeting that it would occur during the regular meeting with President Eisenhower that day, rather than afterwards.
It's coming back to me now. This is one where the skeptical point of view would be that somebody went into the archives and slipped this in among the paperwork. Is that about right? Do I remember the story correctly? It's been about a decade for me now.
Yes, and that's where it gets interesting, because when I pulled this document at the National Archives, there was a memorandum attached from the supervising archivist at the time, and it's a 2-page memorandum giving all the reasons why they suspected that the Cutler-Twining memo was not authentic, that it was fake.
Okay.
And I actually was able to have lunch with the supervising archivist that was in charge at the time and that was involved in the sequence of events. And we went over different possibilities. The common sense conclusion that I came to, that based on that person's input, was that someone probably entered the National Archives as a researcher, pulled that particular box and inserted it into the box. Now, the reason why I say that is a couple of reasons. In discussing it with the supervising archivist, this person was adamant that the document would not have been inserted in the back room, in other words, where the documents were being organized and archived. And that person was pretty adamant about that. Secondly, the security at the National Archives back then was not as tight as it is now. And so that lends the possibility that a person may have been able to walk into there with a document, and insert it into the box, and from the point of being a researcher, rather than some Air Force person putting it in there, behind the scenes.
Understood. That's a pretty gutsy thing to do for somebody.
Go ahead. Yes.
And, I get irate when I hear about Sandy Berger, taking documents out of the National Archives.
That's right. That's right. He got into some trouble for that.
Well, but not enough, in my opinion. I mean, if you or I did that, they'd nail us to a tree.
Yeah.
And so that leads us on to another topic, but if you still want to reverse engineer up the list, again, that's fine. But I wanted to mention something interesting that I wanted to talk with you tonight that you asked us to cover, and that is disinformation and psyops. And that kind of leads me, that's a good segue to this disinformation topic, because it's quite possible that series of documents or file or whatever you want to categorize it as may have been inserted in there as a means for disinformation, not just by a private citizen, but possibly by a government agent. What are your thoughts on the possibility of that? Do you think that documentation was manipulated into the archives? It slipped in there in that manner by a private citizen or by a government agent? What are your thoughts on that, Tom?
Well, I don't know. I just don't know. Now it's hard to believe that just some random hoaxer went in there and did it. And the reason is, in assuming that Bill Moore's telling the truth about this, but in his book, MJ-12 Documents and Analytical Report, and in other ways, he's described how he had been receiving a series of postcards in the mail. And these postcards were giving hints about finding this particular document in the National Archives. There are hints about Reese's Pieces, and there was an archivist there by the name of Reese, and there were some other hints. They were cryptic type hints. And then when Bill Moore and Jamie pulled the Cutler-Twining memo, then these hints made sense. So there's some kind of intrigue going on somehow. I certainly don't know the ultimate answer to that. And now Bill Moore has stated in his own book that there's more to that story, but he, as far as I know, he hasn't told more details about it. Now, as far as disinformation goes, there are several things that are going on. On the internet, you will find a quote or an assertion that Ron Pandolfi, who was with the CIA, stated in the 1970s that the CIA had received indications that the Soviets were going to use UFO researchers to penetrate the U.S. military-industrial complex. So there's a possibility in terms of disinformation and psyops and manipulation that some or perhaps all of the MJ-12 affair in the 80s was designed to deal with this problem. And Richard Doty himself has stated that intelligence operatives within the government had been tasked with developing 2 to 3 contacts each in the UFO community. They want to know what's going on. Now, an interesting sidelight to this is that in the Benowitz affair, and again, I'm quoting Richard Doty, he stated that one of the complications in the Benowitz affair was that Mr. Benowitz had a business by the name of Thunder Scientific, and that one of his employees had been spotted near the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. So the FBI was involved in this, and there were espionage and counter-espionage elements to the situation. At the same time, concurrently, there was the development of stealth aircraft. There was the development of the stealth fighter and stealth bomber. And before they were made public, they had extremely tight security on these. So I think there's another possibility that some of the MJ-12 affair may be related to that in order to divert people's attention away from classified programs.
Okay, and regarding the Twining document, wanted to ask if there was any scientific analysis done to anyone's satisfaction, including Stanton Friedman and yourself and others who really studied the MJ12 documents regarding comparisons of style for authentication, such as penmanship, cultural phrasing, um, uh, any kind of clues or hints that would lend towards piecing together who could have put this document or documents together. Was there any physical evidence, anything that would detect the original authors regarding who could have put that documentation together?
That's a good question, Jan. And forensic work has been done. I don't feel qualified at this moment really to get into any detail about the forensic work. And you can make arguments both ways. Now, one of the complaints about the Cutler-Twining memo is it's not signed, and Stanton Friedman has made the argument that Cutler was out of the country at that time. And there are other objections that come about, and these are actually detailed in the attached memorandum, which is actually next to the actual document in the archive box. If you go into the National Archives and have the box pulled and you pull that document, there is this memorandum attached to it. And I joked with the supervising archivist about this, that it's probably the only document in the National Archives that has a memorandum attached to it telling you that it's probably fake.
Understood. Okay, and if folks want to read a little bit more about the MJ12 documents, just as additional reading, they can actually go to stantonfriedman.com to read more on his perspectives regarding the MJ12 documents that he wrote exhaustively about. And then also wanted to mention that the FBI has its own archives, as Tom knows very well, in its vault. If you were to actually type in Google FBI MJ12 docs, you will see a link that leads you straight to, I think, maybe 8 or 12 pages of the MJ12 docs there. Now, I noticed that the FBI titled those MJ12 docs that it had in its archives as not being real. Do you have anything you want to share regarding any input on the FBI having stated that in its archives about the MJ12 docs?
Well, when the documents became public, it did cause quite a firestorm of controversy. And I think there was even a segment on Nightline about it. And the FBI did undertake an investigation. They wanted to find out if the documents were genuine, if there was an MJ12 group, who possibly created the documents. And they went around to various departments, and I think they came to the conclusion that they couldn't find any evidence either for MJ12, but they also couldn't determine who forged the documents. Now, one of the things they did was they sent it to the Air Force. They sent them to the Air Force, and the Air Force wrote bogus in big letters across. And if you go on the internet and look into this, you'll see it. And that makes me wonder, how would they be so sure that they're bogus if they didn't have something to do with their creation? It's like you put them in front of them and they automatically write bogus over there. So how did they know that? So that's a question.
Or they just knew one of their guys did it while he was kind of freelancing on company time, and they kind of knew. Yeah. You never know.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring up a quote that actually Carl Sagan said regarding topics that we're covering tonight, and that is on stantonfriedman.com regarding the Cutler-Twining memo, and a little bit more on a few other topics. And that is, I'll go ahead and start reading. I'll start the quote from Stan Friedman's website. In his writing, he said, for example, Carl Sagan said, here's the beginning of the Carl Sagan quote, "The Air Force says the documents are bogus, and UFO expert Philip J. Klass and others find lexicographic inconsistencies that suggest the whole thing is a hoax," end of quote. And then Friedman goes on to say, he seems to be unaware of the fact that Klass had paid me or $1,000 for providing more than 14 documents done in exactly the same pica typeface as the Cutler-Twining memo, though classed on the basis of 9 elite typeface documents obtained by him by mail. He had never been to the Ike Library. Of the 250,000 pages of NSC material at the Ike Library, had insisted the CTM should have been done in elite. He's talking about fonts, I think. Some lexicographic research. That's Stan Friedman being facetious there. Our correspondence and a copy of his check to me are in reference number 2. So I just thought that was interesting that he said those things. And of course, Stan Friedman gets very specific regarding typeface fonts and things like that regarding the Cutler-Twining memo. He tried to get as forensic as he could under the circumstances.
Yes, and the copy that's in the National Archives is an actual document. It's not a photocopy. Now, the other MJ-12 documents that Moore received were photographs of documents, so he didn't have the originals. Whereas the Cutler-Twining memo, and it's interesting because the typeface on the memo is actually blue rather than black.
That's interesting. Then I wanted to actually, if you don't mind my randomly asking you something, Philip J. Klass actually created a very in my opinion, from my perspective, very bad reputation for himself amongst serious UFO researchers who were giving the UFO topic the benefit of the doubt, which we know Klass did the exact opposite of. What was your personal perspective of Klass and his type of research and investigative methods and the reputation he created for himself? Did he earn it? How do you feel about about him in general?
Well, I got into the UFO field actively when Phil Klass was pretty much at the end of his career. And he died not too long after I became active in the 1990s. But he is actually quite a good journalist. He was quite a good investigative journalist in the aerospace field. He was very highly regarded and thought of in the journalistic profession that he was in. But for some reason, when it came to UFOs, it didn't matter how good the case was. He would debunk it, and he would always find a reason to debunk it. And that makes you wonder if he's some kind of an agent. And I know it's tempting for UFO people to think that way. He may not have been. It may have just been that he was inclined to think that way, and maybe he was encouraged, behind the scenes subtly. But there's a real disconnect there, because if he had been as prejudiced and as biased in his regular journalistic reporting, I don't think he would have had as good a reputation as he had.
Yeah, he was involved in Aviation Week. He was either the editor or the publisher, or maybe both. Is that about right?
Yes.
Aviation Week?
I think he was an editor.
Okay.
Yeah, he certainly had a hatred, apparently, for the topic of UFOs and other phenomena, and he certainly didn't give it the kind of attention it deserved, I think, from a judicious kind of perspective, as a true researcher would, from my perspective. I did want to mention the organizations he was affiliated with, and that is the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, American Association for the Advancement of Science, Aviation Space Writers Association, National Press Club, National Aviation Club, and another organization that's acronym is CSICOP. A lot of people in the UFO community have called him. They've called him a disinformation and government agent. I'm not sure if that would be correct, because I don't like throwing that term around about people. But he was very quick to call people frauds before actually doing any research on them. And my understanding of how he may have researched people is he may have tried to do really deep background research on people that may not really have been necessary for the kinds of topics they were studying or doing research on.
Yeah, he said some horrible things regarding the people, regarding Lonnie Zamora in the Socorro 1964 case.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So moving along here, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Timothy Cooper documents, if that's okay. If we could cover that topic. Do you mind giving us sort of an introduction to that topic and giving us kind of a summary of what it is about?
Timothy Cooper, to this day, is an independent UFO researcher. He has been recently, and over the years, filing a number of FOIA requests with the government. Now, in the 90s, he began receiving documents from a source that he termed Thomas Cantwheel, which is a code name. We don't know who the actual person was. He had another source that he referred to as S2. And most of the documents that he received are on the Majestic Documents website that the Woods have produced, majesticdocuments.com. And you can go on there and see a lot of the documents that he has received. Now, he had been accused, like so many people seem to be accused, of hoaxing, one or more of the documents. For example, and Stanton Friedman rejected the whole group of Timothy Cooper documents. He wouldn't even deal with it because he started checking into them. He found one document that had a section that had been copied out of a book verbatim or copied verbatim from another document. These documents had obviously been altered. But at the same time, there are reports and white-hot reports and so on and so forth that the content of which is extremely intriguing. Some of the documents have obvious typos, misspellings, so on and so forth, and they appear to be in draft form. Timothy Cooper has, I believe, undergone at least one lie detector test, and I believe that he failed it. And the reason that he gave was he was protecting his sources. So, but in terms of the bulk, in terms of the volume of MJ-12 related documents, most of them come from the Timothy Cooper segment.
Now, which group did the Eisenhower briefing document come in? Was that in the first grouping that went to Chandray, or did it go to Cooper?
Yeah, that was the first group.
And
that was the first group.
Why don't you tell the folks a little bit about that one? That is one that I think Friedman thought was the most credible of all the documents. If that's about right, I'm not sure, but I do know it's interesting.
Yeah, and it was allegedly a briefing for President Eisenhower. It's dated November 18, 1952, and it outlines the Roswell recovery. It refers to another crash at El Indio Guerrero on the Mexico side of the border. And it describes how the committee had been formed to study this. It lists all the names of the alleged MJ-12 members. It also includes a list of appendices or attachments. Now, it doesn't have the actual attachments with the document, but it has something of an index of those. The date format was a point of great controversy because in your typical government document, let's see, what's today? The 23rd?
Yes.
You would see 23 space January space 2020. That's standard government date format. On the Eisenhower briefing document, it would have been 23 January, 2020. And this really tipped researchers off that this wasn't standard form. There are other objections. There are numerous objections to the Eisenhower briefing document. For example, the ranking that's listed, for example, for Hill and Ketter, Admiral Hill and Ketter, and so on and so forth. So there are a number of objections to it. Now, I want to point out something that I turned up in my own research that has really intrigued me, and that is the date of the Eisenhower briefing document is November 18, 1952. And I went through the entire 1952 file of General Twining's daily logs. This is a kind of a boring, tedious process. But after in getting close to the end of the year, and I have this document posted on my blog, on the daily log, General Twining, Tuesday, 18 November 1952, at the time at 15:05, which would have been 3:05, it says, to Mr. Leavitt's office, -- General Eisenhower. And that gave me a jolt. Now, it doesn't prove anything, but it's a very interesting coincidence.
Yeah, just to fill in a little bit here, a little bit of background. Obviously, the top of the month, Eisenhower was elected president. So there would have been some kind of a transition to prepare him to get inaugurated probably in January of early 53. I don't know. I know in those years, sometimes the president was inaugurated a little bit later. But probably, basically a week and a half after he gets elected, he's obviously in the process of transitioning into the presidency. So that he would have had a lot of meetings with current military. That really shouldn't be surprising at all.
No, not in of itself, except that it's the same date as the Eisenhower briefing document.
Right,
and that,
right.
That just that gave me a jolt.
And I wanted to read just a little bit of information regarding that period of time, which is around November 18th, 1952, regarding Truman and Eisenhower. So I'm just going to go ahead and read it. It's on CIA.gov's library's website. And that is, it says, on the 22nd of November, 1952, the newspapers reported that President Harry Truman, shortly after noon the previous day, had stolen away from the White House to give an impromptu speech at the CIA. Truman had come to the CIA at the invitation of the fourth director of Central Intelligence, General Walter Bedell Smith, to address a training course of government officials. In that speech, delivered on a Friday afternoon, almost 2 weeks after the national election, Truman revealed a great deal about his motives in founding the CIA and his aims in having the agency provide intelligence briefings to the new president-elect, General Dwight Eisenhower. So that's just a little bit of history regarding that exact period of time.
Yeah, and a little bit about Bedell Smith. If anybody has seen the movie Patton, there's this kind of burly guy who, at the behest of Eisenhower, is basically reaming Patton out throughout the course of the movie. That is Walter Bedell Smith. He was actually, he became the head of the CIA, but he was actually Eisenhower's chief of staff during the war in Europe, during World War II. So a little bit more history there.
The one, I'm sorry, and thank you very much. I'm sorry to interject, but I did want to mention something about November 18th, and I'm going to hit share screen for my guest and Frank to actually see what I'm looking at. I did include the link in our Skype chat here so that Tom can do some research on this later if he so desires. It says here regarding November 18th in 1952, it says, referring to a widely publicized meeting he had held. I believe they're referring to Truman, but we'll have to double check on this. Referring to a widely publicized meeting he had held with Eisenhower at the White House to discuss foreign policy issues earlier that same week, Truman said, "It was my privilege a few days ago, on the 18th of November, to brief the general who is going to take over the office on the 20th of January." So I'm just mentioning that November 18th date there. And then it goes on to say Truman did not mention in his address that on that occasion he had given Eisenhower a comprehensive national intelligence digest prepared by the CIA, keyed to an NCS policy outline. The digest summarized in Smith's words the most important national intelligence on a worldwide basis. So that November 18th date does pop up a few times in history, and maybe you might be able to correlate that to some of your research. Anyway, just thought I would mention that.
Interesting. And, we hear these rumors that several presidents, that the first thing they wanted to know about was UFOs.
Right. Now, I wanted to mention something about military intelligence and just a tiny smattering of the history of it. And that is the Military Intelligence Corps is the intelligence branch of the United States Army. And the primary mission of the military intelligence in the U.S. Army is to provide timely, relevant, accurate, and synchronized intelligence and electronic warfare support to tactical, operational, and strategic level commanders. The Army's intelligence components produce intelligence both for Army use and for sharing across the national intelligence community. Now, if only it were just that, but I suspect that the U.S. government, I say this as a big maybe, I can't say this as an expert, but I suspect that, as naive as it sounds what I'm about to say, that the U.S. government may covertly be involved in actively creating propaganda around the world, even involving its own U.S. citizens, which it has done in the past. That's a fact. Do you think they're still doing that to this day regarding disinformation and psyops regarding its own U.S. citizens? To its own U.S. citizens.
Well, and the objective of psychological operations is to induce a population to have the attitudes and behaviors that you want them to have. And if you're fighting a war, you want the population to be submissive, the population that you're either conquering or that you're engaging with. And this is the core of psychological operations. So there is this effort of perception management with populations so that people don't get too uppity and they don't start looking in the places that they shouldn't be. Now, the Robertson panel demonstrated in the 1950s, and we don't have the whole document. What we have is a sanitized version. But it became obvious that they had a policy of debunking UFOs. And this public debunking of UFOs went on, up to the time of the Condon report. So that's a documented direct evidence that there was an effort to affect the public perception about UFOs. Now, more lately, we've had the Cold War and we had the conflict with the Soviet Union. And I think that both sides engaged in propaganda and in disinformation. And now, in today's world, we have the internet and we have social media. And I think the whole thing's blown wide open. I mean, it's just so easy to put out misinformation into the public.
Just to jump in here, Tom.
It's a no-brainer.
Just to jump in here, Tom, really quick. A lot of people are of the opinion that the To the Stars Academy is, in fact, a PSYOPs operation. What are your thoughts on all that?
I take a wait-and-see attitude. It's definitely a striking situation, for this group to come out in public. And a couple of the people themselves have been members of the Aviary, and this has made certain people in the UFO community very suspicious of them. But at the same time, it may be a legitimate effort, and possibly from behind the scenes that there are elements within the military-industrial complex that want to get some information out into the public. So I don't take a hardline position on that at all. I take a wait-and-see attitude, and let's see if they're still around in 5 years.
Okay.
I still believe, however, it is possible. And we all know social media is a game changer. Yes, thank you for making that point. But I think it's still possible and not naive to think that our own U.S. government and any other governments, whether they're first or third world governments, are using social media to foster conspiracy theories, plant rumors, and spread fake news regarding certain topics, whatever those topics could be. I think that's just something they do on a regular regarding any kind of counterintelligence efforts, even if it's against their own U.S. citizens. Now, One random topic I was going to bring up that we don't need to go into, but I just want to mention.
Okay, yeah. Before you get to that, Chan, if I can jump in here real quick.
Yeah,
any kind of a psyop is going to have a specific goal. So, you always have to keep that in mind. The expression has become common enough now that I think it's become a little bit loaded, and it's an automatic pejorative. But you have to know what the goal is. Any psyop is going to have a goal. Any disagreement on that, Tom? Or
no, absolutely. But I'm not in those offices where they're planning whatever it is that they plan, so I don't know what their goals are.
Right. So one really old.
But I agree with you 100%, Frank.
One really old topic that we won't go into, but everybody is aware of to a degree, is the Project MK Ultra CIA mind control program that they actually used on Canadian and U.S. citizens through CIA assets. And they had different code names for those projects, such as Project Bluebird or Project Artichoke and many other code names. And they actually conducted illegal experiments on U.S. and Canadian citizens. So those were strange experiments, but also I think there was some kind of strange propaganda that may have been spread during that period of time. The point is if a person were to actually Google some kind of keywords like the United States intelligence, propaganda programs, they will come up with some very good articles from publications that are reliable and by trusted sources that have been actually able to detail definitively the history of that. And that's actually happened for a long time now.
Yeah, mainstream news organizations being on the CIA payroll and so on and so forth. It's a long, sordid history.
It is. It's a very long history, which we won't go into. But I'm very glad that you brought it up, Tom, on your, on the list of topics we're going to go over, because I think, I just want to share a little personal information. When I was growing up, as a teenager, I would wonder, just like any other teenager, are these things possible? Well, I couldn't look this stuff up because we didn't have the internet. So then I'd have to go to the library, and how do you look up something like that? So you don't really know where to begin. Then you have microfiche, I suppose you could look through, but so time consuming, like you'd literally have to be so myopically focused on that narrow topic matter, and that it's very difficult in the narrow scope of it to find it. Now you can find anything. And so a person can really become a lot more educated on these really interesting topics. And hopefully a person will also take into consideration that we can all become better people by learning more about this kind of history. That's the best way.
And Chant, just a quick question for you. I'm not old enough to know what this. What is microfiche? I'm not old enough to know what that is. How do you know what that is?
Right. Well, Tom,
do you want to explain
him what? Do you want to explain him what microfiche is?
No, I'm kidding.
I know, he's just being a jerk.
If we have a minute, I'd like to relate one story.
Yes, please.
Yeah,
do.
Sure, absolutely.
And I just want to let our listeners know, by the way, to the folks that don't even know what payphones are, or
I've seen them in old movies. I don't know what they are.
Microfiche is a flat piece of film that contains microphotographs of the pages of certain kinds of documents, like a newspaper, a catalog, or anything. And you can just flip through it on a screen, and that's the end of that. Tom, please go for it.
There was an article in the Wall Street Journal. It was either in the late 80s or the early 90s, and it was on the subject of disinformation. And the public awareness of the topic of disinformation had originated from Soviet activities. Their word was disinformatia. And this story in the Wall Street Journal, and Frank, you were talking about the disinformation or the PSYOP having a goal. The goal was to get people in the Middle East very upset and mad at the U.S. And what they did was the Soviets apparently planted a story in a Middle Eastern newspaper that we know that when the astronauts visited the moon, that's obviously an awesome experience, and one or more of them have had spiritual experiences because of it, and that's only understandable. Well, this story was that an astronaut who walked on the moon, an American astronaut that walked on the moon, heard the call of Allah, and he converted to Islam, and when he got back to the U.S., his career suffered for it. And this infuriated people in the Middle East. And I thought that was an excellent example of disinformation because it's partly true and partly false. Yes, astronauts walked on the moon. Yes, some astronauts had transformative experiences because of it. But no, they didn't convert to Islam.
Let me jump in here and at your blog, Tom. It's a great blog. Go check it out. I'm going to have the direct link in the description section of the video, but you might want to jump over as we're talking about different subjects. Tom's got articles over there, and it's tomwhitmoreblog.wordpress.com, but the link's down below. But there's a couple of things that you've got, like a very lengthy sort of to-do, getting done, and already done list. And one thing is you have reviewed Nathan Twining's personal correspondence logs for 1952. Did you turn anything up related to the DC-52 UFO case?
No, I didn't notice anything like that, Frank, but you saw the document that I had on my blog where I think it was General Sanford who had, they mentioned saucers.
Yes.
On the chronology. What was in there, though, was a lot of conversations with General LeMay. And General LeMay kept in very close touch with General Twining. And they actually, it wasn't exactly a transcript, but there were pretty extensive notes on their conversations. And a lot of it is a little bit hard to follow, because those two men knew what they were talking about,
right,
and why they were talking about it.
Yeah, tell the folks a little bit.
I found that to be very interesting.
Yeah, tell the folks a little bit about Curtis LeMay. He's a pretty interesting guy.
Well, what I know about him, he was a bomber in World War II, and I know that he was involved in bombing Japan. They started out bombing at a high level and at a high altitude. And I think because of the winds and other problems, they weren't getting the accuracy that they needed. So they switched to a much lower level of bombing in altitude. And I believe at the time that General Twining was Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force at Washington, that General LeMay was at Wright-Patterson at that time. And as you know, General LeMay was very instrumental in developing the Strategic Air Command. So,
yes, sir.
And he eventually became the Chief of Staff of the Air Force himself. So he was a very key figure in the development of the modern Air Force after World War II. And I can tell you from looking at Twining's daily logs that he was in very close touch with General Twining.
Understood. Yeah, just a little aside, later on in life, he became the vice presidential nominee when George Wallace ran an independent campaign for president in 1968. So
yeah, these guys were real right wingers. General Twining
LeMay was a right winger for sure.
And you hear about these generals wanting to bomb Cuba.
Yep.
Kennedy trying to hold them back. So, these guys were ferocious.
Yeah, and another DC guy whose name I see mentioned over at your blog is a guy named Dick D'Amato. And his name has come up a little bit, but for folks who didn't catch those shows where his name did come up, why don't you tell the folks a little bit about him?
Mr. D'Amato is a very highly qualified, highly educated person that has been in very responsible positions. He's been in a staff position in Congress. And the reason why I brought up his name is because there's a story that he allegedly took Jesse Marcel Jr. into a secure room at the Capitol and basically told him that Roswell was real. And the reason why I brought up D'Amato's name in my own blog is because I wrote Mr. D'Amato a letter requesting contact to see if he would confirm that story. But if you go on Mr. D'Amato's website, he basically tell you that he doesn't have anything more to say about UFOs. Okay? Now,
he did for a while. I mean, there was a legitimate interest. He's one of those insider Washington guys. Like a few of them, we're seeing the names sprinkle out here and there. But he was an insider. He's retired now, and I think living in Maryland. But he's a guy who's been interested all along, and has always tried to, ferret out some information here and there.
Well, there's another incident. I'm sure you're familiar with Robert Dean's claims that he saw this assessment at NATO headquarters. And Mr. Dean, according to his story that he told in an interview with Michael Salla, he said that he was over in Europe, he was at a UFO conference, and he took a side trip back to NATO to talk to people there because he was getting a lot of flack for his claim of having seen this UFO assessment paper. Well, when he got back to the United States, Robert Dean claims that he received photographs of documents in the mail anonymously, and these photographs were allegedly from part of this assessment. Well, Mr. Dean said that he gave these copies of photographs to Richard D'Amato to find out if they were genuine or authentic. Well, then Dean said that he found out later that they turned up with Timothy Good and had been published in some publication or another in Britain, and I haven't been able to locate I know the name, but I haven't been able to locate the publication. The implication being that Mr. D'Amato sent the photographs over to Timothy Good, so that's another incident.
I wonder if I'm sure you have, because you know this person quite well, to a degree, just like the rest of us. We're familiar with who this is. But Isaac Coy, the archivist and researcher regarding being able to compile as much UFO data as possible for the UFO community, perhaps maybe he might be able to lend a little bit of support to find that kind of publication, since he's such an expert on the archives of various publications.
Yes, that's a good suggestion, Chant, and I have another contact over there I'm going to try. But thank you for the suggestion.
Yeah. I wanted to also ask you about something very interesting, and that is Bigelow. Before we go forward with Bigelow, though, I just wanted to quote you in because I actually had the privilege of interviewing you, was a while back. I think it was last year. Actually, it might have been 2018. I'm not sure. I'll have to double check on the date of this interview. But I had asked you, and this is a random thing, but I just want to mention what you said because I think it's kind of interesting. I asked you, what do you think are the worldwide psychological, religious, economic aspects of disclosure? And you got the gist of what I was asking. And you said it's definitely related to what the true history is. Jesus introduced by ETs, humans genetically created by ETs, ETs here for millions of years. How many species have been involved? Is there a connection with demonology, angelology? Why are people undergoing abduction and contact experiences? How much technology does the U.S. government have? Talk about a can of worms. These were just ideas you were throwing out there. How do you feel about what you said, and would you change your answer at all, Tom, on that question?
Well, like I've said before, Champ, if it's true that there has been this inside knowledge at least since 1947, how do you go out to the public and tell them that you've been lying to them for the last 70 years? Secondly, if there were disclosure, and I don't think there will be, it depends on what the disclosure is. And we get into the business of wondering if we shouldn't be careful about what we ask for, because what if there's bad news in there? For example, it's known the FBI keeps track of the number of missing people in the U.S., and this has been discussed by the gentleman with Missing 411. But there are some people that go missing that aren't accounted for. And we hear these reports of abductions and rumors of abductions and cattle mutilations and even human mutilations. So what if what if there's bad news in there? I think that comes into play.
Well, and just very quickly, I wanted to ask you, so do you feel that the Glowing Auras and Black Money article that came out on December 16th of 2017, do you feel that that was partial disclosure and not quite enough? What is your thought process on the level of disclosure that interesting article brought about that was sort of a kind of dropped like a bomb in the UFO community?
Yeah, well, and it really piqued my interest in certain respects, which I won't get into here. But
okay.
I don't believe that we've had any level of disclosure. I think that what we need first is substantive confirmation. For example, the government military industrial complex produced the B-2 bomber. Well, they had a ceremony. They rolled out the bomber, and they had a ceremony dedicating it. That's firm, substantive, confirmation that it exists. And on the disclosure side of it, you can get books that show the inside of the B-2 and the cockpit and get all kinds of information. That's disclosure, okay? Now, in this case, we have received what I consider to be soft confirmation. For example, we've had these videos of these objects that the Navy had encountered and that Luis Elizondo has discussed extensively. And they know that something's going on there. So it's been brought into the public arena and into the public consciousness. And that's a form of soft confirmation that maybe UFOs are a legitimate subject to talk about now. Okay. And maybe we've gotten that far, but as for any real substantive disclosure, I don't think we're there. And I've heard it said that there are elements within the government military industrial matrix that want to disclose, but they don't know how to do it.
Okay, I see. And didn't the government?
So Tom, sorry to interrupt, Chant. I'm out of practice, so but I haven't had to interrupt you too much lately. But this is more like to use the spy jargon, more like a limited hangout. Would you say?
Yeah, very much so.
You guys broke up. What a limited? I didn't hear.
Limited hangout.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, and we're getting this stop-start, and I got this impression way back in the 90s that in terms of this rollout of information, that they seem to have their foot on the accelerator and the brake at the same time. And even with these items coming out from DOD just within the last few weeks about the status of Mr. Elizondo and the status of the ATIP program and so on and so forth, we're getting all kinds of conflicting information. I call it mass confusion.
Yeah, definitely there was some conflict between, in terms of the frequency question. How often are these really compelling cases where you might have visual and radar confirming a visual sighting? So at one point, he was speaking at the SCU conference and said they didn't have that number. And then on the TV show, he says they've got it, but it's a sensitive number, so he couldn't go any further. But just for the folks not familiar with what a limited hangout is, it's been described as spy jargon for a favorite and frequently used gimmick when the veil of secrecy is shredded and you can no longer rely on a phony cover story to misinform the public. They resort to admitting, sometimes even volunteering, some of the truth while still managing to withhold the key and damaging facts in the case. So there you go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I just wanted to mention an article that just came out recently, and CBS News and a bunch of other mainstream media outlets covered it. And that is that I'll just read the title of one of the articles, and that is Top Secret UFO Files Could Cause Grave Damage to U.S. National Security If Released, Navy Says. Tom, what is your take on that perspective by the U.S. government?
I don't think the military wants to release anything. And I think that somehow Elizondo and company found a way to get these videos out into the public. And I've even heard the rumor that there was a Navy admiral that got tired of people being ridiculed in the Navy for having UFO sightings. So I don't think that the government or the military would release anything on their own voluntarily. That's of a sensitive nature, or that's potentially of an explosive or sensitive nature. And I think, like I said, I think that Elizondo and company found a way to get that information out.
And just to jump in real quick with a question, Tom, during the Unidentified show that ran last year, the first set of shows, anyway, I guess there's more to come, but Elizondo was really specific, and he said, "I am not Rick Doty." Now, do you have any thoughts on that, since you've looked at Doty's background a little bit? What were your thoughts on that comment?
Well, I don't know why he said that, but I'll say this about Rick Doty. Unless you can demonstrate that Richard Doty was not an Air Force Office of Special Investigations special agent, I think that basically he should be believed. Now, I think we should also be careful. And he's made many very interesting claims.
Yeah, I mean, he's Tom. I'm sorry to interrupt, but he's saying that the government knows that these aliens are from Zeta Reticuli. He's made that comment openly. He said it on a TV show our good friend Earl Grey appeared on later in that show. So you said he's made a lot of extraordinary claims.
Yes, and he said that he has other claims that are even more extraordinary, and the only reason why he doesn't come out with them is that people would accuse him of making it up. But I'll tell you this, he's getting ready to come out with a book. And to tell you how sensitive his work has been, he said in several interviews that he wrote a 430-page book, and the Air Force censored 300 pages of it. So he's had to rewrite a good portion of the book, and that's caused some delay in its publication.
I did want to mention to everybody that Paul Dean did write a very interesting article on Rick Doty on June 13th of 2018. It's on his blog, UFOs Documenting the Evidence, blogspot.com. Just type in Paul Dean and UFOs, and his blogspot will come up. And the title of the article he wrote is Finally, Richard C. Doty's United States Air Force Service Records, Well, Nearly. And it's important for folks to know Paul Dean, who's a historian and researcher, has compiled a lot of very fascinating information on Richard Doty through FOIA information requests to the Office of the Secretary of the Air Force for copies of Richard Doty's USAF service records. And they are on his website right there. And so you would go to UFOs Documenting the Evidence blogspot, type in those keywords and Paul Dean, and you will see all of these interesting documents on Richard Doty's USAF records. Whether it's complete or not, I don't think it is, because that's what he alludes to in his title, saying, well, nearly. Anyway, actually wanted to ask you something I forgot to ask you. I'm very sorry, Tom. And that is the Richard Doty interviews. The Richard Doty interviews that you listened to very carefully, probably repeatedly, was there anything, what was your takeaway from that? What did you glean from that and decide upon regarding your research on those interviews?
Well, like I said, I'm believing that Richard Doty was an Air Force Office of Special Investigations special agent, and he has said repeatedly that when he started that work, he was brought into a briefing at Kirtland Air Force Base. An Air Force colonel came down from Washington and briefed him and several other people in AFOSI who they felt needed to be read into this information because of the kind of work that they were doing. And Doty has stated, and this is a point of education, I think, for all of us, because I think sometimes the public and the UFO community gets things a little bit mixed up. But the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, according to Doty, part of their responsibility is to investigate UFO sightings on military bases and that affect military personnel, military assets, and military locations. So if something weird happens, something strange happens, AFOSI gets involved. Now, in saying that, Richard Doty has claimed that they showed a film that was from Roswell, the Roswell recovery, and that even Truman was there. Now, I don't know if Truman was allegedly at Roswell, so to speak. I'm putting that in quotes, or if it was another location. They filmed him there. But this is a pretty extraordinary claim in and of itself. He said that they had shown him different shapes of UFOs. They showed several different types of alien entities, and basically explained that the government had been involved, secretly in this UFO program since the time of Roswell. Now, that's a pretty extraordinary claim, but he's consistently been telling that story. And it's basically either true or it isn't. And I don't know how we get to the bottom of that.
I'm very glad.
Because they're not going to show us the briefing.
Now,
Right.
there's also been some folks who are of the opinion that Doty was involved in putting together the Serpo documents, and you mentioned that, so I'd like to know what your opinion on that particular material is.
According to what I believe that Doty has said, is that the Serpo story originated out of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Doty has stated repeatedly in different interviews that he's with a group of retired intelligence operatives, from various branches of the government. They get together once or twice a year and they compare notes. And according to him, he and his group had been conducting an investigation into Serpo. I got the impression that he didn't believe that all the information in the Serpo story was true. Doty has also claimed that they located and actually interviewed the last surviving member of the Serpo team, which is very intriguing. Now, UFO investigators had tied Doty's email or internet address to the Serpo documents, and Doty has his side of the story of that. So, again, it's murky, it's kind of complicated, it's ambiguous.
But you think there might be some truth to it, though?
And again, according to Doty, he's been told both ways. One person tells him there's no truth to it. Another person tells him that it actually happened. So,
okay. And this is basically there is a site. I think it's serpo.org. There is a site where they're all up, and basically it is a story of if you remember the very end of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where Roy Neary and kind of joins a team of people who go off with the ETs back to their home planet. And the story is basically that this is the account of what happened when they went back to the home planet. And that Close Encounters was essentially based on this true thing that really happened.
Yes, that's correct. And the idea being that when the craft and the bodies were recovered in 1947, that one of the aliens survived and they managed to establish a certain amount of communication with him, and and there was technology that they recovered from the saucer. This is the legend. This is the story, okay?
Right.
That they recovered from the saucer and they were eventually able to communicate with the aliens' home planet, and they arranged for the aliens to come pick up their dead, and then they also arranged for an exchange program. And I know it's outlandish, but if there's any truth to any of this, I mean, it's really not all that out there. You know, it's hard to believe how all this could be kept so secret, but if there's any truth to it, they're awfully dead serious about keeping this secret from the public.
Okay, yes. And actually, Frank, I think was right. I haven't had a chance to really gloss over this site very long, but you can go to www.serpo.org to find out more information regarding the kind of topics that Frank and Tom are covering now. And then I also wanted to invite folks to go to openminds.tv and read an open letter that Alejandro Rojas wrote about Richard Doty and the allegations of criminal misconduct. And I'll just read a smattering of it. I won't read very much, but it starts off by saying, it starts off by saying a lot of things, but I'm just going to go and dip into allegations of criminal misconduct. Air Force Office of Special Investigations agent Richard Doty claims to have partaken in the acts of misinforming members of Congress, breaking into the private residence of a civilian government contractor, and disseminating known forgeries of government documents while on active duty in the 80s. Furthermore, he claims to have committed these acts on the orders of his superiors at AFOSI, which is an acronym, AFOSI. Frank, I can never remember what
Air Force Office of Special Investigations.
Thank you. Okay, thanks for reminding me of that.
Yeah, it's safe to say Alejandro hates Doty. That is fair to say.
Yeah.
He's expressed that on this show directly to me and the chant. So no question there. Said
that because he was and not to rant here, but just to share a little bit about what Frank just said. Frank's right. We had Alejandro Rojas on our show, and he was extremely, not just adamant, but very emphatic about how much he cannot stand Richard Doty. Now, I'm not trying to say anything about Richard Doty other than say Alejandro Rojas was irate about him, and it was very interesting listening to him talk about it in this topic in such an emotional manner.
Yeah, he was fired up, no doubt.
And anyway, if anybody wants to check that out, all they have to do is type in Google openminds.tv, Alejandro Rojas, Richard Doty, and that open letter that he wrote very well will be there for folks to read. It's an extremely long article.
Well,
and the serpo.org. It's well worth taking a look at and reading it. I think it is fan fiction. I'm not convinced any of that is at all real. But it's worth the read. It's worth going through. It's part of UFO history one way or the other. So go take a look. And also the MJ-12 documents themselves. You had mentioned Ryan Wood. He's got a site, and you can just actually go to his site and read them for yourself and make up your own mind.
MajesticDocuments.com.
Do you mean Dr. Robert Wood?
Yes, Dr. Robert Wood and his son Ryan Wood. Yes.
Okay, right. That's right. I'm sorry.
On that open letter, and we were mentioning, I reviewed 11 interviews that Richard Doty gave. And in one interview, he said that Alejandro Rojas had been a thorn in his side and had published this open letter to the Air Force. And Richard Doty said that I don't think the Air Force ever answered Alejandro Rojas, but Richard Doty said that they sent the copy of the letter back to Richard Doty.
That's interesting. Now, just
I'm guessing they don't exchange Christmas cards.
I don't think so.
One thing I just wanted to mention about Doty and the MJ-12 documents is on that open letter that Alejandro Rojas wrote about Richard Doty, he quotes Doty here as saying, according to Doty, begin quote, "The FBI did an investigation on me because of the MJ-12 documents. It was 88 or 89, meaning the year. They thought I disclosed those documents," end quote. And then Alejandro goes on to say, if this is true, the results of their investigation have yet to be revealed. And Alejandro wrote this article, it looks like, on May 6th of 2014. So anyway, that's it. And how do you feel about the possibility, Tom, of Richard Doty possibly having been involved regarding the MJ-12 docs in any way, shape, or form whatsoever?
Well, if you expand the definition of the MJ-12 documents to include the documents that Bill Moore lists in his book, the MJ-12 documents, there was apparently a phony UFO report that had been sent to APRO that Doty may have been involved with. It may have even been a counterintelligence exercise. There was controversy around the so-called Aquarius telex, and which contains actually the first public reference to MJ-12. But a lot of people assume that Doty asked Moore to give that to Paul Benowitz, even though I'm not sure that is even the case. It's true, and Moore has said that he had been asked to give this document to Paul Benowitz, which he did. But whether Richard Doty had anything to do with that I'm not sure. There was an instance where Linda Howe was brought into Kirtland Air Force Base, and she was shown a document, and Richard Doty was involved in that. But that doesn't mean that he created the document. He has said that he was an employee of the United States government, and he was acting under orders. He said that he had received awards and commendations for his work, even from the president. And this whole FBI thing, he said that and these are his claims, but he said that he had undergone 2 lie detector tests and passed both of them. And these government level lie detector tests are really serious. And he said he had been cleared of any wrongdoing with all of this.
That's interesting.
And it's a fact. He hasn't been indicted, and he's not in jail. So whatever he was doing within the context of whatever counterintelligence activities were being conducted by the AFOSI.
Thank you for sharing your insight regarding that topic. I wanted to share with listeners, there's an interesting film, and then I want to ask you what you think of it, and then we'll need to go ahead and wind down, regarding Mirage Men, which is a 2013 documentary film directed by John Lundberg and written by Mark Pilkington, co-directed by Roland Denning and Kipros. I can't even say his last name. I apologize. Kipranio, I suppose. The film had its world premiere at the 2013 Sheffield Doc Fest, and I feel kind of naive saying this, but I actually had not seen this film until my co-host Frank Stalter told me and insisted, you need to watch this film. He kept telling me, and I kept saying, yeah, okay. And I finally watched it, and I really just was so glad that Frank kept on me about this, because I thought it was a very interesting documentary or film, whatever folks want to call it. And I wanted to ask you, Tom, what was your thoughts on what Richard Doty had to say in that doc, and just your overall perspective regarding that film? What do you think it accomplished?
I'm fascinated by the general topic, this whole topic of counterintelligence work and disinformation and psyops and all of this, and the interaction with the UFO community and the whole MJ-12 affair, and I've meant to say all along tonight, Chant and Frank, that the MJ-12 documents were like a hydrogen bomb being dropped on the UFO community, and the UFO community has never been the same since. But again, and I keep quoting from Richard Doty's interviews, but he's very unhappy with that book and that movie, and he had problems with the producers of that, and he I think he's gotten a little bit gun shy in certain ways, because I think he feels that he's gotten a bad rap, and part of the reason why he's gone out on a lot of these interviews is to tell his side of the story and hopefully set the record straight. But the general genre of this counterintelligence work, and these question documents coming into the public arena. And all of this is fascinating to me, and Mirage Men and the video and the book I watched and read avidly.
Thank you very much for having shared that. By the way, I go into the CIA archives an awful lot, and I just wanted to make a comment about what you said regarding Richard Doty, but I'll lead up to it with some personal stuff. Frank knows this. I'm like on CIA archives every day, always looking for something, typing in crazy words in the search engine, and sometimes I come up with some really interesting stuff. And I think there was an article that was really old, but it was about counterintelligence agents, and they're basically trained to actually, at least during the 50s, 60s, 70s, so on, trained to mislead leaders of nations. That's literally to the level some of them are trained to mislead folks. So they're trained to mislead maybe at times in a hierarchical manner, meaning like just for civilians, maybe others to mislead leaders of nations and everything in between, that kind of thing. Now, my understanding is Rick Doty worked at Area 51, maybe S4 specifically, to actually, he was there to monitor any Russian activity that may have been occurring in a counterintelligence type fashion or other kind of intelligence fashion. He was there to possibly protect the S4 area of Area 51 to keep the Russians from infiltrating that area or having any influence or taking information out. That is my understanding. Now, I could be wrong about that, and I don't mind being wrong. But at the same time, if he is a self-confessed disinformation agent, it's really difficult to put a lot of stock in somebody who claims to be a disinformation agent and then have sour grapes about it later. And so the fact that an individual is trained to manipulate and lie through professional means because that is their job, I find it hard to have sympathy for that person. What are your thoughts on that? Everything I just said, Tom, if you don't mind, a little bit of insight regarding how you feel about all that.
Well, and again, I'm sorry to keep repeating from him, but I can relate what he said in these interviews, and that is they get a situation, they take it into the office, they write reports, their supervisors look at it, then it's usually run up the flagpole to D.C., and the higher-ups in D.C. decide what action they want to take or not want to take. And the instructions come back to the local AFOSI office with instructions and plans and directives and orders, and then it's their job to carry that out. So I think people have gotten the impression that Richard Doty and people like him just dream up ways to make people miserable. And they have a job, they're trained. You know, he went to pretty extensive training before he ever started doing this kind of work. And he now it's possible maybe he misbehaved at times, maybe he was overzealous, you know, that's possible. But I believe that he and anyone else in that milieu is doing their job. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And some of these nefarious schemes, like this whole affair with Paul Benowitz that people have gotten so upset about, some of that could have been cooked up in Washington, D.C. They wanted it done that way. So, I as for having sympathy, maybe that's not appropriate, but, give the guy a break.
All right. Well, I really want to thank you for having taken the time to allow us to just ask you anything and be so specific and so definitive And just also want to thank you for being so patient too, because oftentimes I'll jump from topic to topic just to sort of test a guest on their knowledge base regarding whatever it is we're bringing up, and just really feel like you've covered everything so wonderfully. And I just love listening to you. Sometimes I forget to even ask you a question and I told you this before, Tom, I really think that you should just have your own podcast and a series on everything that you have to say, because I know that people would love to just listen to you talk. And want to let people know that they need to go to tomwhitmoreblog.wordpress.com, and that is Tom, WHITMORE, blog.wordpress.com. And I'm going to say it one last time, tomwhitmoreblog.wordpress.com. Please go there, and also know that that is a site in progress. I suspect that it's also going to become more fleshed out as time goes forward. You're going to have a lot more information on there. Not that you do not now, because you do. You have quite the list there of topics. And also look forward to any more information that you're going to come out with in the coming months and years. Tom, thank you so much for having been on our show tonight.
Thanks a lot,
Thank
Tom.
you,
I
Jan.
really appreciate it. I had a great time. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Chan and Frank. I've been delighted to be here. I've enjoyed it very much.
All right, so we're going to wrap up here, and thanks for listening in. And I don't have the schedule in front of me, but I think we have something, if not this Sunday, then the following Sunday. We've got something else, and I'll have to check to see who's going to be on with us. But we'll be back before you know it. So thanks for joining in, and good night, everybody.
We